I love Tailwind, but it doesn't scale. It solves so many problems that make the point of needing scale way further along, and I can't imagine not using it going forward. But there are a lot of other solutions that we can learn a lot from too. Panda CSS to vanilla extract to style components itself, there has been a lot of unique exploration in the CSS and JS world and the CSS ecosystem as a whole. And Facebook has learned a lot from it, and they built something really cool here. When I first went in, I was skeptical because it just kind of looked like too much work. And as a Tailwind-brained person, I didn't see why I would want to use this. But after reading the principles and diving deeper, I ended up really hyped with what I found. And I think you guys will be excited too. Even if you have no intention to leave Tailwind, because I certainly don't, we can still learn a lot from what StyleX is doing. And I hope y'all will be as excited as I was when I read through this. So without further ado, the docs for StyleX. And they're so fresh, they're still on a vercel.app page. That should give you an idea of how early this is. We're in before most, but I saw this on Twitter and I really wanted to talk about it. StyleX itself is not open source yet. Despite the GitHub link, I think this just goes straight to Docusaurus. I think they plan to open source it, but the focus has been solving their problems internally. The documentation being public is kind of just a nicety to let us know this is real. They do have conference talks where they've previously discussed StyleX and why they made it. If you want to hear about these things as soon as I find them, make sure you're following me on Twitter because I tweeted about this because I was really excited about it. StyleX, the power of inline styles and the speed of atomic CSS. They're embracing what makes atomic CSS so powerful while also being as powerful as inline styles generally are. This is a big part of why I like Tailwind so much because inline styles aren't bad because they're a bad DX. They're bad because they don't scale. And Tailwind found a really good way to make atomic pieces that you can inline with class names and have a good scalable solution. But StyleX is a very different direction. Step one is you define your styles. If you're a React Native developer, this probably looks very familiar because it's very similar to how you define style objects as style sheet entities in React Native and then apply them to elements. So once you have defined container as a sub key within your StyleX object, you can now access that by calling styles.container. So this behaves a lot like how we write CSS traditionally, but it integrates directly in our JS. This is kind of like CSS modules plus, but with a lot more power and dynamic behavior potential and really good opportunity to add like strict lint rules and enforce type checking so that you know all of these things are being applied the way they're supposed to be. It's a really different way of doing things, and I'm hyped to see how this is going to work. So let's take a look at the docs and see some more examples here. The default example here, we have a main element, which has width 100%, max width 800, min height 40, and active, which shrinks the scale very slightly when something is active. You could also import this if you export it, import it other places, now you have access to it. And then here we see div class name StyleX, and this is an array, so you can pass it conditions, you can pass it pieces, you can pass it things that come through props, and if you pass it false, it's fine. So this syntax makes it really easy to conditionally apply something. That's actually really nice. It kind of has, this is like if you've used CN or class names, this is very similar, but built in as a core part of StyleX. StyleX itself is framework agnostic. So here's using it inside of lit.html. As you see, you can apply it. I guess that means that StyleX is going to dynamically update this element, because how would this rerun? Interesting. All styles are compiled into atomic class names and bundled into a single CSS file. So you get the ease of use and expressiveness of inline styles without sacrificing performance. That makes sense. So yes, people are asking, does it precompile? It absolutely does. It bundles all of the things in your code base into a single CSS file. So you're able to create like a design system that has StyleX exports that generates a CSS file you can include. And now you just apply the StyleX class names through the StyleX helper. And it works kind of like Tailwind, but reusable and shareable across projects and teams and code bases and design systems and all of these intricate layers that most companies end up with at scale. Features at a glance, expressive, easy to use API that's as simple as inline styles, apply styles conditionally, merge and compose arbitrary styles across component and file boundaries. This is a big one. They don't specify it here, but across code base boundaries is a big part too. Like different repos could export the CSS and the JS object, and now you have all that you need to consume that in a separate code base entirely. I would see this as being a much happier experience packaging out so people can consume it than something like Tailwind. In fact, we've tried really hard to make a good consumable layer with Tailwind for upload thing, so you can customize the buttons. And we pulled it off, but it was difficult. And if you're not able to customize your Tailwind config, or you have really complex custom CSS already in your application, the relationship between those things can get pretty rough pretty fast. This is a solution where packaging your styles will be much easier overall. And I could see a future where someone builds something similar to ShadCN's Shad UI on top of this instead. Use local constants and expressions to keep your styles dry, or repeat yourself without worrying about performance. ability to use dynamic styles when you really need them with minimal overhead, an expressive and simple API for theming with CSS variables. I haven't actually seen how they do variables yet, so we'll get there in just a moment. Predictable. Last style always wins. That is huge. I don't know if y'all understand how big of a problem this is. I talk about this in my other Tailwind videos, but the order that your CSS is in the CSS file, that's what determines what renders, not the order you apply class names. So if you have A then B, where A has a background color and B has a different background color, and they're in that order in the CSS, but you apply B then A in the HTML, B will override A, even though A comes after, because B comes after in the CSS. It's super unintuitive, and having that as a built-in guarantee in the framework is really nice. Style encapsulation is also a really nice part. All styles are caused by class names set on an element directly. So complex selectors are never style at a distance. This also means that you can right-click, go to definition, and it will bring you to exactly where the style was defined, which is a really nice way to know what style you're applying when you're writing. Is it as good as just seeing it in the HTML itself with Tailwind? No, but it's damn close and allows you to define those elements in your own design system and language around these primitives. Comparison with other tools. This table may be wrong. Oh boy, everybody loves these tables. So StyleX is static, atomic, has a style format, collocation, composition, dynamic styles, and types. Tailwind has kind of collocation. That's bold. I think it's actually some of the best collocation. And then composition, yeah, Tailwind's not super composable. There are like Tailwind merge and other solutions like that, but not the best. Dynamic styles, I don't think it's fair to say this is more dynamic than Tailwind when this just has class names built in. So this I'll disagree with. I think they're both equally dynamic in that sense. There might be more dynamic behaviors in StyleX I haven't seen yet, but this is my gut feel. In types, when you're just a bunch of class names and you can enforce that through a linter, or even with Prettier and the Tailwind plugin for Prettier, this I found matters a lot less. And there's also ESLint rules that can confirm all of your Tailwind classes are real Tailwind classes. So as much as I am big on types, Tailwind not being typed isn't the biggest deal. That said, putting types as one of your top level things you're considering a core feature is huge. And they're also comparing here to vanilla extract, which is probably the most similar thing, where vanilla extract is, I don't know how to put it. TLDR, you define CSS in TypeScript with really strict typings that compiles out to CSS, and then you consume it by importing the element that is created by it. It actually syntactically looks nearly identical. Create theme applies like that. And then you have style, which background color, whatever, color, yada, yada, all coming from the theme variables. And then hero can be consumed as an element, very similar to what we just saw. They don't do the nested StyleX object, where instead they focus on each of these elements being their own separate called style tag, but very similar overall. I also realized I haven't said what collocation is. The best I can TLDR it is the place with your markup. So your HTML, JSX, whatever, is co-located with the style itself. So the style isn't in a separate file or in a separate code base. If it doesn't have to be, you can write that inside of the HTML or JSX itself, which is really powerful if you are trying to maintain systems and make changes quickly, because the context of everything you need is right there. It's not applied with a class name you have to go find the CSS file for and hope it's going to behave. It's right there. And I guess that's why they're saying kind of for Tailwind, because the CSS that's actually applied is coming from somewhere else, but it's a one-to-one mapping. So this doesn't feel super fair, especially since we have incredible tools to let you know exactly what that applies. It's a universal language. But again, semantics, and I see why they said kind of here. If vanilla extract doesn't have this at all, you have to have a different file with your styles. A compiler step reads and generates the CSS from. So that's another huge win for StyleX over vanilla extract. Oh, they even have a glossary for all these terms and how they define them. Collocation, are the styles in the same file as your component, is how they defined it. So yeah, dynamic. Are dynamic values for styles possible? Interesting. Now I'm curious about their variable stuff. API theming with CSS variables is unstable, may change. Good to know. Official plugins for things like Next are still either unusable or non-existent. Good to know. I don't want to get started. I want to look at the variable stuff. Danger. Theming API for defining and overriding CSS variables are experimental and subject to change. Very good to know. In addition to authoring styles for your components that generate atomic styles, StyleX has APIs for defining CSS custom properties in a reliable, predictable, and type-safe way. The design of theming APIs in StyleX is directly inspired by React's context API. CSS variables are defined globally and should generally have default values. Interesting that they say similar to React's context, CSS variables are defined globally. Because yes, a context is defined globally, but it's scoped in how it's consumed. And I'm curious if these are scoped or not in how they're consumed. So these are variables: primary text, secondary text, yada, yada. Using media queries. CSS variables can have different values depending on a media query. Interesting. Dark is at media, prefers color scheme dark. Default black, dark white. Default this, dark that. Yeah, that's pretty nice. I like the syntax. Rules when defining variables. CSS variables are the one exception when it comes to the rule of StyleX. You can import CSS variables from a different file and use them when authoring your styles with StyleX, but you need to follow a few rules. CSS variables must be authored in a file with .stylex.js. Makes sense, that's how the compiler catches them. CSS variables must be exported from the file as named exports. Now we're starting more and more like file-based routing, getting a little scared, but I get it. Named exports, colors, StyleX create var, sizes, cool. Export default, yep, only named exports are allowed. This is not allowed because it's not a direct export, and nested is not allowed. Interesting and good to know. No other exports are allowed in the file. For now, StyleX is exclusively for defining CSS variables. So how do we actually consume them? So declaring, we have that. And then using StyleX.create, container color, colors.primary, background, colors.background. Are there conditions with them though? You must use named imports for a StyleX.js file. Yep. Variable overrides. This is where things get interesting. Once you have a variable defined, you can also create overrides for them to use for subthemes. Okay, so we declare the variables. Oh, I see. Var's provider lets us override some of these. You can define override providers anywhere. Interesting. So these go through an entirely different pipe internally. Interesting, because for the variables to work this way where they need StyleX.js, it's because they're compiling that into traditional CSS. For the overrides to not require that, they're doing something different for these, which is very interesting. I'm very curious to see under the hood how these differ in implementation. And then consuming, interesting. When you call StyleX in an element like this, you can pass it a bunch of what become class names, but then you can pass a theme which will override the variables from before, which seems very powerful as a way to conditionally style elements, have specific active overrides for different colors and things. It's a very interesting pattern. I'd have to see this in use to really have feelings about it, but this is fascinating. This is very different. Almost feels like functional programming where it's going top to bottom, applying whatever changes are necessary based on the StyleX object that you put next in the list. This is very interesting. Advanced usage patterns. The API for variables is designed to be simple and easy to use, but also scales to support complex use cases. Here's some things you can do with variables in StyleX that may not be obvious. You can define different variable sets for different types of tokens. StyleX enforces that you define your variables as groups when using create vars functions, but you can use the function multiple times to create logical groups for your variables. You create variables from other variables. That felt kind of obvious to me. I wish they had an example for this. Yeah, I wish I had a better example for that. You can create many themes using providers and apply them to different parts of your app. You can create many different override patterns for your variables and apply them conditionally and dynamically to different parts of your app to enable custom themes. Okay, so I'm starting to see the difference here in the variables with the override layer, where you can't override a variable that doesn't already exist. So when you are declaring them in the StyleX.js, this is creating the CSS tokens that can now be targeted and giving them default values. Where with this layer in the var provider, this is targeting those same native keys that have been created in the CSS layer for those tokens and changing how they are applied in specific parts of the DOM, which is very interesting. Here's the doc about their core principles. I probably should have started with this because this is the core of why they made it. To understand why StyleX exists, why it makes the decisions it does, it's important to understand the core principles that guide it. Zero cost abstractions. When it comes to performance cost of StyleX, our guiding principle is that StyleX should always be the fastest way to achieve a particular pattern, i.e., unless you opt into a feature, you should never pay for it with runtime performance. Make this trade-off of doing more work at build time to improve runtime performance. Here's how this plays out in practice. Basic styles authored and used in the same file. So this is if you use a style and you don't export it. Styles is StyleX.create red color red, let a is StyleX. Files down to just let a equals this. No runtime cost. But where is the CSS that it outputs to? That's the part that is missing here, but that's fine. This is an early doc. Using styles across files. When passing the style across file boundaries, you pay a small cost for the additional power and expressivity. StyleX.create call is not deleted entirely and instead leaves behind a very simple object mapping keys to class names. In the StyleX or StyleX.spread calls are executed at runtime. So this code, styles is StyleX.create, and then I'm assuming that they mean this is being called somewhere else in a different file. Styles is this, and then StyleX applies those dynamically. Interesting. It's definitely a little more code, but the runtime cost is still minimal because of how fast the StyleX and StyleX.spread functions are. I'm excited to look at source code for this. Most other styling solutions don't even let you compose styles across file boundaries this way. The state of the art is to simplify combined lists of class names. Slap me in the face, why don't you, Facebook? We get it. CN is not the best solution to everything, but it's gotten us really far. And CVA, class variance authority, is cool, but you're way ahead of us here. Fine. Style should be deterministic and predictable. CSS is a powerful and extremely expressive language. However, it can sometimes feel fragile. Some of this stems from a misunderstanding of how CSS works, but a lot of it stems from the discipline and organization required to keep your CSS selectors with different specificities from stepping on each other's toes. Most existing solutions to this problem rely on rules and conventions. BEM and OOCSS introduce naming conventions such that we don't run into many of these problems, but it puts the burden on the developer to follow the rules, and it mostly just tells you not to merge styles at all. This can lead to bloated CSS. The amount of hell I've went through with BEM at Twitch and the amount of styles that are being shipped on Twitch that aren't being used for anything, it's all hilarious. And moving these problems out of sight, out of mind is one of the biggest wins of Tailwind. Like, Tailwind doesn't have you think about the name of things that are being reused even. It just works. And that's a huge difference from how any of these old solutions worked that were based on CSS, because you'd have to name the thing before you could apply a style to the thing. And you have to come up with some schema for making sure these names are correct, and then find some way to make sure when the thing's gone that CSS gets deleted too, which it almost never does. Tailwind just solves that by being atomic class names that are provided. This solves that by compiling the CSS based on your actual application that you've written. Atomic utility class names like Tailwind CSS and tachyons rely on convention to ensure you don't apply conflicting class names on the same element. This limits you to a small subset of CSS's expressive power to make your styles reliable. That's fair. I haven't missed much of that crazy expressive power of CSS, honestly. I get why some would, but again, Tailwind provides the vast majority of what I'd ever want in CSS with a really simple abstraction that I can reuse across projects without having to import anything, which is really powerful. But if I was building one design system to be used by literally thousands of engineers every day, this is a much better starting point. StyleX aims to improve on both the consistency and predictability of styles and the expressive power available. We believe this is possible through build tools. That's a big one, that they think build tools are the solution to this problem at the core, and they're focused on that primarily. StyleX aims to give you a completely predictable and deterministic styling system that works across files, and we aim to not only give you deterministic results when merging multiple selectors, but also when merging multiple shorthand and longhand properties, margin versus margin top. I have run into some stupid things because of this. I'm happy that that's being handled. Yeah, the last style applied always wins. Why do people act like it's okay that CSS does this wrong? I've complained about this a lot, and people will always say, Theo, you're dumb. Obviously, CSS is a different order than your HTML. Obviously, when you apply things in HTML and JS, the CSS is where the real order is. That's not fucking intuitive at all. That's a really bad thing for us to just defend for no reason. And it looks like they agree. And one of the core principles is that the thing at the end of the list of styles, anything you apply there, that's going to apply there. Hacks like important should not be in our daily vocabulary, but they are because the way CSS applies based on order is nonsense. So I'm really pumped that they're focused on that as like a core part of what they're delivering. Especially at Facebook scale, this seems essential to me. And for those wondering how we handle this in Tailwind, we sort the class names. If you don't use the Tailwind plugin for sorting your class names, it's a prettier plugin. So if you're not using that, you're going to run into this problem. It's going to be really hard to debug. If your class names aren't the exact same order as your CSS, things get really unintuitive, and they just don't have that problem. They built around it. Anyways, more core principles. Readability and maintainability over terseness. Most recent styling solutions are extremely terse and easy to write. Tailwind CSS is popular and lets you author your styles by putting extremely terse utility class names directly on your markup. This is great for authoring styles quickly, but in our opinion, the long run of it makes the styles harder to read and maintain. It can also have a steeper learning curve up front. I don't fully agree. The big thing that you get from Tailwind is deep co-location. So when you do need to make a change or maintain something, it's very easy to identify where that is and make the change fast. But if you don't already know Tailwind, it's not the most readable thing, for sure. I sympathize, I get it. And on a code base as big as Facebook, even finding the right element in the code base from where you are in the HTML is a difficult enough challenge as is. I think this is more a dev tooling between the browser and your editor problem more than anything. But I can see why doing this all at JS level makes this easier to solve. StyleX makes the choice to use the same CSS property names that you're already used to. We decided to use camel case instead of kebab as it makes it easier to type in JS. This makes it easier to learn and read. We also enforce that your styles are authored in objects separate from the HTML elements where you use them. We made a decision to help with the readability of your HTML markup, and so you can choose appropriate names for your styles to indicate their purpose. Styles.active tells you much more about the purpose of a bunch of styles than what those styles are themselves. This principle leads to trade-offs where authoring styles may take more typing with StyleX than some other solutions, but your styles will be more readable and maintainable in the long run. I think they also missed the point where StyleX doesn't inline, so you have to break this out on top and then give a name to everything. So it's not just more typing, it is more cognitive overhead. Having to come up with a name for every single thing in your application before you can even start applying styles, that's real mental overhead. And this isn't accounting for that. It's not just more typing, it's more effort from the developer on both creation and identification. So I don't fully agree with this point, but I understand the angle they're coming from. Small API surface area. At its core, StyleX can be boiled down to just two functions, StyleX.create and StyleX.spread. You use .create to create a bunch of styles, then you use spread to apply them to an element. Other than the fact that create takes static values, you don't really need to learn anything else about how it works. Things work the way you would expect when dealing with JavaScript objects and arrays. Other functions with the StyleX API should be simple utilities that feel simple and obvious. Like first that works lets you define a series of fallback values for a property. It's kind of a funny name, but I like it. First that works. Feels really like dangerously set in our HTML of them. Keyframes lets you define CSS keyframes for animations. Create vars lets you define variables. And vars provider lets you define a class name to override the default values of CSS variables. All makes sense. Co-location of styles and markup. There are benefits to making your code dry, but we don't think that's true when it comes to writing your styles. Thank you, Facebook, for acknowledging this, because yes, your styles should be near your markup. People separating them rarely can justify it. Life is much easier when the style causing something is closely located to the thing that it's changing. Really nice hearing big names like Facebook acknowledging that dry is overrated, especially for styles. The best and most readable way to write your styles is to write them in the same file as the markup where you use them. Repeating yourself is not a bad thing when it comes to styles. StyleX enables you to write your styles in every file where you use them and repeat yourself as many times as you want, and it automatically deduplicates all the generated CSS to give you the smallest bundle possible. Fantastic. Styles should be type safe. I love this as a top line. That's bold. And here, to the person who's saying this is just vanilla extract, they immediately call it vanilla extract as big here, but also it's path breaking. But it's so good. And I'm really pumped that they're learning from the ecosystem. I'll read this because it's good. TypeScript has become massively popular due to the experience and safety it provides. Our styles, however, have largely remained untyped and unreliable. Except for some path-breaking projects such as vanilla extract, styles are just bags of strings in most styling solutions. Yep, even in Tailwind. Obviously, the prettier plugin in ESLint can help there, but it's not as good as proper types, especially once you're extending the defaults. StyleX is authored in Flow with strong static types. Its packages on NPM come with auto-generated types for both Flow and TypeScript. When there are incompatibilities between the two type systems, we take time to ensure that we write custom TypeScript types to achieve the same level of power and safety as the original Flow. I will admit, this hurts to see. I understand Flow is an internal repo at Facebook at this point, and they just make changes to it whenever one of their projects needs. It's just another dependency for them. But man, it's not used externally anymore for a reason. All styles are typed. When accepting styles as props, you can use types to constrain what you will and will not accept. That's actually really cool. This means you can type a component to take a prop for what styles it is allowed to override. So you can say that this is allowed to override class name, this is allowed to override text color and text size, but none of these other things. That's really, really powerful, and I'm excited to see it. Framework agnostic. StyleX is a CSS in JS solution, not a CSS in React solution. Banger. Absolute banger. This is very well written. It's designed to be used with any JavaScript framework that lets you author your markup in your JavaScript. It can even be used with frameworks where your markup is stored in separate templates, although that's not the ideal use case. React is probably the best fit for StyleX, but we'll make improvements to make it work with various different frameworks over time. All makes sense. Style encapsulation and debuggability over power. Yes. Again, making sure things can be fixed, identified, changed, and maintained at scale of Facebook is a top level concern for the StyleX team. Ooh, that is a banger. For the ones in the back, this statement: all styles on an element should be caused by class names on that element itself. To be very clear what this means, they're throwing away the cascade part of cascading style sheets. Elements should not have styles applied to them because of things above them, certainly not because of things below them. They should have styles applied to them because you gave them a class name that describes the thing it should do. This makes debugging behaviors, not worry about side effects, all of the chaos of styles at scale, so much of that goes away if you throw away the cascading part of CSS. I think this is a really, really bold and very, very good decision. CSS makes it very easy to author styles in a way that lets you cause styles at a distance. Like all of these examples. We have a class name and has a sub element, and we want to target that. Or on hover, we want to apply something to the first child. All of these patterns, while powerful, make your styles fragile and harder to debug. I absolutely agree with this. This is 100% aligned with my experience building CSS at the scale of something like Twitch. When you're applying target selectors that hit other classes or hit other elements from the class you're applying them to, debugging becomes miserable. And their decision to just not support that is bold and exciting. Styles such as color will still be inherited, but that is the only form of style at a distance that StyleX allows. And in those cases too, the styles applied directly on an element always take precedent over the inherited styles. I'm happy that they said that for color that this applies, and I'm happy that they made that decision. God, yeah. This is a very good, bold statement to make. And as I said here, this is often not the case when using complex selectors, as the complex selectors usually have higher specificity than the simple class name selectors used for styles applied directly. So if you had something that targets first child of an element and changes the text color, but that element has a text color applied, this is going to override it in most cases, especially if this comes later in the CSS file itself, which it probably does. StyleX disallows this entire class of selectors. This sometimes makes common patterns in CSS impossible, like it's currently impossible for a child element to have a conditional style when its parent is hovered. We'll find ways to make these patterns possible in the future without breaking the core principle. I like how group works in Tailwind, where you can group things with the prefix, but it's not powerful enough when you have like layered groups where like two groups are overlapping a bit. So I'm excited to see how they solve this in the future. Style should be modular and composable. NPM has made it extremely easy to share code across projects. However, sharing CSS has remained a challenge. When using third-party components, you either have to choose components with styles baked in that are hard and impossible to customize, or headless components that are completely unstyled. Yep, there's a secret third option, and it's really fucking hard to deal with, so I don't recommend it. The lack of a good system to predictably merge and compose styles across packages has also been an obstacle when sharing styles within packages. Yes. And I can't even imagine at Facebook scale building a package that has a default set of styles and components and allowing that to be reused and augmented and composed all over Facebook is incredibly difficult. And I see here, this is a specific goal. StyleX aims to create a system to easily and reliably share styles along with components within packages on NPM. As we see here, this is still very early. Despite being very well written, we're still going to have the occasional typo. And now for the final principle. A single file is better than lots of lazily loaded CSS. Louder for the ones in the back once again. A single CSS file will be a very maintainable solution. Browsers handle it really well. But if every time you add more CSS to your code base, that file keeps growing, that's not going to scale great. And this is why they said here, most styling solutions lead to CSS growing linearly, and that makes large applications using one CSS file infeasible. This was absolutely our experience at Twitch. Because of that, you end up splitting your CSS into multiple files and loading them lazily as you need them. This improves initial load time and performance, but it comes at the cost of slower updates, as the browser needs to recalculate styles every time more CSS is loaded. And every time a new file comes in because a new component was mounted, it has to recheck all of the old files and all of the old applied styles to make sure this new file doesn't change anything. Not great. With StyleX, we're aiming to create a system where the total amount of CSS is small enough that you can load all your CSS upfront without a significant performance penalty. The StyleX model doesn't make lazy loading or critical CSS impossible. We are not optimizing for it now and are focused on generating the smallest, fastest single CSS bundle possible. This is once again super aligned with both the general atomic CSS movement as well as with Tailwind in particular, where you just have one CSS file that is generated based on everything you did in your code base. This is a really big win, and I'm pumped to see almost all of these core principles. I wish I started with this because this is really good. What do you think about StyleX? I did not expect it to be this cool going in, and I'm really hyped. I'm excited for a future where more and more CSS solutions have learned these same lessons and are working with a subset, or ideally the entirety of these principles, in order to make good, scalable styles across code bases of every size. It's so cool seeing the dope things we learned from stuff like Tailwind and like Vanilla Extract all being applied into a focused, scalable solution that Facebook is actually shipping today. I'm excited for a future where this is all open source, and as a community, we can keep learning and growing with what Facebook has done here. Huge shout out to the team for putting out these docs. I know that there isn't much of an incentive as an internal tool to put this time and effort in to share it with the world, but we do appreciate it a lot, and I learned a ton reading through this, and I'll be certainly referencing this a ton going forward. If you want to read more about StyleX, I'll leave a link in the description. If you want to learn more about other style solutions, put a video in the corner there all about the other things I like to use. Thank you guys again. Really appreciate y'all. Peace, nerds.